When Nell and LaTisha decided to sit down together, the whole idea was that they could finally clear the air. It was supposed to be a moment of peace, a moment to talk things through like two grown women, and maybe even rebuild a little trust. Instead, what happened showed just how deep the tension really runs between them. What started as a calm coffee meetup quickly turned into a messy back and forth where every sentence carried weight and every look seemed to mean something more. You could feel the frustration, the defensiveness, and the unwillingness to let certain things go. From the very beginning, Nell carried herself with a calm energy. She came in ready to talk, ready to explain, and ready to keep the situation under control. Her tone was steady, her body language was collected, and she made sure not to let her emotions push her into a place she didn't want to be. LaTisha, on the other hand, seemed to arrive with a mixture of frustration and the need to defend herself. The moment certain topics were brought up, it was like her walls went up even higher, and instead of listening fully, she leaned into being defensive. That's where everything started to shift from what could have been a peaceful talk into something chaotic. Nell opened the door to conversation by asking how LaTisha was doing and making it clear she wanted to talk about what had happened. She didn't come across as harsh, but she was straightforward. That alone was enough to make the air tense because LaTisha immediately tied the conversation back to the issue of her husband. She mentioned how Nell had gotten into her husband Chris's face at the party. That was her first point of tension, and once she put it on the table, the entire conversation started turning into a tug of war. Now, Nell didn't deny that a conversation had happened. She admitted that she remembered it, but what she did not agree with was LaTisha's description of how it went down. LaTisha felt Nell came at Chris with too much energy, while Nell insisted she was never on 100. Right there, you see the problem, two women experiencing the same moment in totally different ways. One saw it as calm and necessary, while the other saw it as aggressive and unnecessary. Instead of agreeing on the memory, they both stood their ground. And when two people both feel strongly about what they believe happened, it becomes nearly impossible to move forward without clashing. The issue grew deeper when the topic of the NDA came up. LaTisha brought up that conversation as part of her defense, while Nell made it clear that she didn't report to LaTisha and had already talked with her husband about it. Right there, the tone shifted again. For Nell, this wasn't about proving herself to anyone, and she wasn't going to let LaTisha act like she had control over what conversations she could or couldn't have. LaTisha, however, clearly wanted to reframe the situation and pull in points that made her feel justified. Then things took another turn when LaTisha mentioned that this wasn't the first time something had been said about her husband. She pointed out that Nell's husband, Chris, and her husband, Marceau, had past conversations, including that infamous trip to Atlanta. For viewers, that moment felt like déjà vu because once Atlanta is mentioned in this circle, the tension automatically rises. Suddenly, instead of just focusing on the here and now, they were pulling in old situations, old suspicions, and old words that never really got resolved. LaTisha pointed out how her husband had once told her Chris had taken a selfie to prove where he was, and she used that as part of her reasoning. Nell immediately shut it down, saying that was not true, because she remembered exactly what happened during that time. This back and forth about Atlanta shows the deeper layer of distrust. It wasn't just about the conversation at the party or the way words were exchanged. It was about years of issues, rumors, and questions that both women were still carrying. When those old wounds come back up in a new disagreement, it makes the argument even heavier. Nell, through it all, kept her composure. Even when LaTisha accused her of not taking ownership, she didn't let her voice rise. She acknowledged her feelings, but she didn't let herself get dragged into a shouting match. LaTisha, on the other hand, kept circling back to her point of ownership and accusing Nell of dodging responsibility. The problem was that her version of ownership seemed to mean Nell agreeing with her perspective, and Nell wasn't about to do that. She stood firmly in her truth. The conversation kept spiraling because instead of staying on one point and working it out, both women kept pulling in other names and other stories. Marceau's name came up, Chris's name came up, Fletcher's name came up. Every time a man's name was thrown into the mix, the argument got sidetracked. Instead of focusing on their relationship, the conversation became about who said what, who was where, and who brought up whose name first. That type of distraction only made the tension worse. What was most interesting about watching the two was how differently they carried themselves. Nell spoke calmly, directly, and with control. She didn't let herself get flustered, and even when LaTisha's tone shifted, she stayed level. LaTisha, however, carried a tone of defensiveness, almost like she needed to prove she was in control of the situation. Her words carried an edge, and at times, it came across as condescending. Instead of simply listening, she tried to dominate the conversation, and that only made the situation unravel even more. As the argument went on, it became clear that Nell was not going to allow herself to get dragged into a loud, messy scene. She even said directly that if the conversation was going to continue with disrespect, then she would not take part in it. That's when she set her boundaries clearly. LaTisha accused her of already being disrespectful, but Nell didn't let it go there. She stood by her words and her calm presence. She wasn't going to match LaTisha's tone or let her pull her into an ugly back-and-forth. By the end, the conversation had reached a breaking point. Both women were tired of talking in circles, both felt disrespected, and neither one wanted to keep going in that moment. Nell chose to end the conversation with dignity, pointing out that this wasn't the place for yelling and chaos. She reminded everyone that the location they were in was actually a space where she met with parents from her children's school, and it wasn't the right setting for an argument. That choice showed maturity and self-awareness. Even when the conversation was falling apart, the most powerful takeaway from this whole scene is that communication only works if both sides are actually willing to listen. Nell came in calm, collected, and ready to talk. She didn't deny the past, but she also wasn't going to accept a version of events that she didn't agree with just to please LaTisha. LaTisha, however, came in with her guard up and ready to defend herself. That type of energy makes it almost impossible to have real progress because instead of finding common ground, the focus becomes proving who's right. For viewers, the contrast between Nell and LaTisha was crystal clear. One woman showed how to keep her composure and let her words carry power without raising her voice. The other showed how defensiveness and condescension can make even a small disagreement feel much bigger than it really is. That difference in approach made the chaos even more obvious, because while one woman was trying to bring peace, the other was leaning into control. This conversation wasn't just about two women disagreeing, it was about trust, respect, and how the past always has a way of creeping back into the present. When Nell calmly stood her ground, it showed strength. When LaTisha tried to redirect and pull in other names, it showed distraction. And when they both walked away without resolution, it showed just how deep these tensions really go. Sometimes, sitting down to talk it out doesn't fix anything at all. Sometimes, it only reveals that there's still a lot of healing that needs to be done, and that's exactly what happened here. A simple sit-down meant to clear the air ended up turning into another layer of drama. But the way each woman handled herself gave everyone watching a clear view of their personalities, their priorities, and their ability, or inability, to truly communicate. In the end, the chaos said more than the words ever could.